Edmund Kemper is one of America's most infamous killers. Enormous in stature, disarmingly articulate, and brutally methodical in his crimes. He grew up in a troubled household. As a teenager, he was small and bullied. Then at 15, he committed his first murders. He killed his grandparents in their home. Tried as a juvenile, he spent several years in custody and was released in his early 20s. The experience didn't steer him straight. It sharpened a dark curiosity about violence that would return with far greater horror. In the early 1970s, in and around Santa Cruz, California, Kemper began picking up young female hitchhikers. Over a roughly 1-year span, he abducted, murdered, and mutilated 6 college-age women. The crimes were savage and ritualized. He strangled his victims, sometimes engaged in post-mortem sexual acts, and ultimately dismembered and decapitated several of them. He kept trophies and photographs, physical records of control and obsession that investigators later found in his home. Kemper's final murders were the most personal. Driven by a long-standing violent hatred of his domineering mother, he returned to her house and murdered her and a female friend who was present. After those killings, he did something unexpected. He called the police, confessed, and then led investigators to the evidence. His surrender ended a spree that had terrorized a community. At trial, Kemper's size and demeanor were striking. A 6'9" man who spoke calmly about horrific acts. He was found competent, convicted of multiple counts of murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, he became a notorious interview subject, clinical, self-aware, and articulate about his motives and fantasies. His cooperation and bluntness later helped law enforcement and behavioral scientists better understand sexual homicide and offender escalation. Kemper's case remains chilling because it combines ordinary biography, family dysfunction, early violence, social alienation, with intentional, calculated brutality. He is neither myth nor monstrous caricature. He is a studied example of how personal rage, fetishized control, and opportunity can produce calculated, remorseless violence. Richard Speck. July 13th, 1966 started like any other night at a small townhouse in Chicago, and ended as one of the most brutal single nights in modern American crime. Richard Speck forced his way into a dormitory that housed 9 student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital. He tied some, terrorized others, and then, over hours, murdered 8 of the 9 women who lived there. The violence was methodical and remorseless. The house became a crime scene that shocked a nation. What saved the case, and later put Speck behind bars, was one tiny, terrible detail. One woman, Corazon Amurao, hid under a bed and survived. For hours she listened as the night unfolded, and when morning came she slipped away and reported what she'd heard. Her testimony and later identification were decisive. Within days, police arrested Speck after he turned up at a flophouse and was recognized. He had no plausible alibi and quickly became the prime suspect. The arrest led to an intense, highly publicized investigation and a rapid prosecution. At trial, Speck appeared unrepentant. The courtroom scenes fed a media frenzy that treated the case like a national horror story. He was convicted of the murders and originally sentenced to death. Years of appeals and shifting legal standards followed, but Speck spent the rest of his life behind bars, dying in prison in 1991. The crime's impact went beyond criminal records. It exposed failures in urban safety, intensified fear about violence against women, and changed how police handled mass victim scenes and survivor testimony. Corazon Amurao's survival and courage were widely credited with preventing Speck from vanishing into anonymity, and the case remains a stark reminder of how one person's testimony can turn the tide in an otherwise unspeakable tragedy. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, BTK for bind, torture, kill, lived a double life for decades. A quiet Midwestern family man by day and a calculating killer by night. He began murdering in Wichita, Kansas in 1974. His early crimes followed a pattern. He broke into private homes, surprised victims, restrained them with elaborate knots, and killed them. He took trophies, kept secrets, and then did something rare. He wrote. Over the years, Rader mailed letters to newspapers and police. Those letters weren't just boasts, they were taunts and puzzle pieces, written in a mocking, clinical voice. The communications created a public terror far bigger than the actual body count. People stopped answering doors at night. Parents locked windows. The city lived with a constant low-grade panic. Rader's public face made the case worse. He was active in his church, married with children, coached youth groups, and held a respectable job. That ordinary exterior kept suspicion away. Investigators had no obvious suspect. The BTK letters shaped the police hunt. They tracked handwriting, followed every clue, and cataloged each deadly signature Rader left behind. In the 1990s, the murders stopped. Rader vanished from headlines. Then in 2004, he made a critical mistake. He started communicating again, and this time he used technology. A floppy disk and other digital traces allowed investigators to link messages to a specific church and finally to a single man. Police served a search warrant. They found evidence he couldn't deny. Confronted, Rader confessed in full, even recreating details for detectives and admitting the motive: a need for power, control, and the attention his letters brought. He pleaded guilty in 2005 and received consecutive life sentences. Today, he remains in custody in Kansas. The BTK case left lasting effects. It exposed how a killer can hide inside normal life, it showed the fear sown by taunting media, and it stands as an early example of digital forensics, how one careless file can undo decades of secrecy. Jerry Brudos, known as the Shoe Fetish Slayer, was one of the most disturbing killers of the late 1960s. Growing up in Salem, Oregon, he had a troubled childhood marked by rejection from his mother. At a young age, he developed an obsession with women's shoes, stealing them from teachers and neighbors. This fetish grew darker as he began breaking into homes for lingerie and shoes, eventually merging his fantasies with violence. In 1968, Brudos escalated to murder. He lured women under false pretenses, often pretending to need modeling help. Once inside his home, he attacked them, strangling and assaulting them. He posed their bodies, photographed them, and kept trophies such as shoes, underwear, and even body parts. His garage became the center of his crimes, while his family remained unaware upstairs. Between 1968 and 1969, he killed at least 4 women: Linda Slauson, Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally. His downfall came when survivors and witnesses described a man with a shoe obsession approaching women. Police traced these reports back to Brudos, and he eventually confessed in detail. He was sentenced to life in prison and remained there until his death in 2006. Even behind bars, his obsession with women's shoes never left him, showing how his fetish had defined his entire life and crimes. Monty Rissell is one of the most disturbing figures in Mindhunter, not because of his body count alone, but because of how young he was when his killing spree began, and how casually he later spoke about it. Born in 1959 in Virginia, Monty grew up in a broken home. His father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings largely on her own. That instability, combined with a sense of rejection from women in his teenage years, began shaping his violent outlook. By 14, he had already committed his first rape, for which he was arrested and sent to juvenile detention. He was released a few years later, but the system didn't rehabilitate him, it hardened him. In 1976, when he was just 17, Monty Rissell started killing. His first victim was Aura Gentry, a 26-year-old college student. He stalked her, forced her into his car, and after raping her, strangled her and dumped her body in a river. This was the beginning of a year-long killing spree across Alexandria, Virginia. Over the next 12 months, he murdered 5 women in total, all of them subjected to brutal sexual assault before being killed. What's striking about Rissell's crimes is the lack of compulsion or ritual that many serial killers display. He later admitted that he sometimes killed his victims simply because he didn't want them to report him. Other times he claimed he was just angry, yet when the women became targets of that rage. His murders weren't meticulously planned, they were cold acts of opportunity, which made him unpredictable and even more terrifying. By 1977, Rissell's spree came to an end when police linked him to a stolen car connected to one of his victims. During questioning, he gave a detailed confession to all 5 murders, speaking in a disturbingly calm and detached way, as though describing errands instead of lives he had taken. In court, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. In Mindhunter, when Holden Ford and Bill Tench interview him, what stands out isn't just the crimes, it's how unemotional he is. He describes rape and murder with the same tone as talking about chores, giving insight into a killer motivated less by fantasy and more by cold indifference and anger. Rissell's case became an important study for the FBI's early profiling work. It showed how early trauma, sexual violence at a young age, and untreated rage could combine into lethal behavior before someone even reached adulthood.